Thank you for tuning in to NARA podcast, a place where we aim to make sense of the modern world. From the studio in Vilnius, my name is Eglė Murauskaitė. Our podcast is back to our weekly routine, and today we have a special episode. As you can hear, it's in English. It's a partnership between NARA and Contemporary Art Center in Vilnius, and the episode is hosted by our friend and colleague, Eglė Elena Murauskaitė. Enjoy.
Welcome to NARA podcast. My name is Eglė Elena Murauskaitė. I'm the senior scholar at the University of Maryland. I specialize in international security issues. You have heard me discuss a variety of geopolitical, broad strategic topics over the years with NARA, but as you may or may not recall, there's always a very strong social angle to it, and looking at both conflict and human existence from a more complex standpoint. Art, I have found over the years, always gives us a language for exploring issues and conveying our insights from a very different angle, and yet very helpful. For example, over the past few years, when I've been working on the conflict in Ukraine, one of the projects that I have recently engaged was doing a soundscape installation at the National Lithuania Drama Theater, where we use Ukrainian war sounds to give people a different kind of an immersive experience as to what it's like to be in the war, to feel the war zone, rather than the usual, explosive pictures on TV and the military views. So today we have another opportunity to take a broader perspective on both the global security context and also where Lithuania fits into this, together with a Dutch artist, Edwin Zwakman. So Edwin has been invited here as one of the artists showcasing his works at the National Gallery of Art. An exhibition is opening on April 7th that is called The Outsider's Look on Vilnius, and it showcases basically a spectrum of foreign artists' creations made in, for, or about Vilnius. And in terms of a temporal perspective, it covers three distinct periods. One following the World War I, so the early stages of Lithuanian statehood at that time, at the beginning of the 20th century. Then moving on after the World War II and through to the Soviet occupation. And then the early independence period up through to the integration into the Western structures like NATO, the European Union. And that's where Edwin Zwakman's work comes in, covering specifically this latter period. So Edwin has done his first installation here in 2004 when the Netherlands were taking the presidency of the European Union. So Edwin, why don't you say hello to our listeners and give us a few short words about yourself and about the work that you do.
Yes, hello. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's great. I'm a quite internationally operating artist from the Netherlands. Mostly conceptual works in a variety of media, everything from building concrete structures to doing interventions in the streets, or right now augmented reality installations. And I also lived abroad a lot. I studied in Germany, lived in the UK for 5 years, 3 years in China, Beijing and Shanghai. And that really changed my perspective on the world deeply. It is the best way, especially living in a non-Western country was a big eye-opener. And every time I read the newspapers now or hear the news, I don't really understand or know China, but I know what they're saying in the news. No, that's wrong. That's just not the right information. Everybody should do it, really. It's the way to get to see a different view.
It's fantastic to hear you say that. I mean, we could do a separate podcast about China, but
I would love to. Yeah. It's
so thinking about I'm thinking about the Netherlands, and you immediately mentioned some street performance and live sort of action installations. Lithuanian listeners will probably be very familiar with the works of Marina Abramovic, who did a lot of this performative work in the Netherlands, specifically with her partner. And it seems like perhaps it's a skewed perspective. Maybe it's generally Western Europe, but it seems like that performative art as such, performance as a genre, has really taken off there way before it did in Eastern Europe, in Vilnius. So do you want to tell us a little bit about the project that you did back in 2004 and like how it may be compared to your other work, the specific installation?
Yeah, it was a really interesting time then, of course. We were invited with a couple of young Dutch artists to do a work for Vilnius. So we came twice, which was a great luxury, to a couple of weeks to just get to know the city. And then half a year later, we were supposed to come up with something meaningful. So that's always ridiculous, but it's also a great challenge, of course. And at the time, also the second Gulf War was raging in Iraq. And I was I was really, really mad, basically, about how the media were operated and manipulated by your employer, the USA Army, because they were reading so on top of the narrative in a very clever way with this embedded journalism and everything. That I really wanted to do something with that, which had nothing to do with Vilnius, of course. But it did have something to do with our nations being in a very peaceful situation, looking at the world from that perspective at the time. What I did briefly, maybe that's the most concrete way to describe it, was to paint several city buses in Vilnius white with UN on it, thus creating the illusion of a UN operation, a peacekeeping operation in Vilnius, and follow these vehicles with helicopters and cars, filming them day and night. And so we got kind of a footage that really resembled the kind of shaky cameras that we saw then in the Iraq War from the embedded journalists from tanks going through the darkness there. But now they were going through the city of Vilnius. So to me, it was very much about a mixture of basically the images that we know from the news and your everyday life surroundings. And oddly enough, that's now the link to the exhibition today, because now the work that we made them, all the footage that we shot, the photographs, the films, they are now in an exhibition about the city. So the city in the background actually now is the main player. It was then kind of a collateral imagery, basically. But of course, it also documented the city very well, with the buses going through them the whole time.
Yeah, and the city has changed a whole lot. But so out of curiosity, why Vilnius? So why not Riga, Tallinn, or Warsaw?
Well, that's the thing. That was totally random in a way. I was obsessed with this UN presence in the media. And I actually did UN operations in several cities, like Vienna, Aachen. That was very good with excavators. And every time it generates a new story, right? The vehicle becomes a symbol, and the symbol becomes a catalyst, which provokes a new reaction in every given situation. It also reflected the impossibility of coming to a city as a Dutch artist, having to do something meaningful out of the blue in a city that you don't know at all. But that did remind me of the whole mechanism that we have, as a Western culture, have been trying to do with the whole world. We come to places, we create a narrative, we see what we would like to happen, and then we implement it with force. Or first, of course, with persuasion. But whether it's and the UN is very often instrumental in that. I mean, the UN, in that sense, does not exist really. It's a mock-up. If you see a peacekeeping operation in the news in a crisis zone, these are tanks from maybe Austria and trucks from Turkey, and they're painted white with UN on them, and it's a kind of a simulacrum, basically. And it's easy to also do that as an artist, of course. I'm a painter. I can make a simulacrum. I was creating actually a new narrative.
So that is very interesting. I love how you've put it, that the West is sort of enforcing its narrative on spaces it's not super familiar with. And I want to pick on this, but just first share a brief observation that Lithuania historically has tended to be a huge champion of foreign policy of the United States, and was actually one of the first nations to jump on the bandwagon to support the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, and has regularly sent special operations troops to support it. So these wars are actually super popular in Lithuania, and generally U.S. Foreign policy and this approach. So Lithuania doesn't do a whole ton of peacekeeping itself. So I think that these narratives that you're describing, they're not so familiar looking from the perspective of being the implementer of this enforced narrative. Nevertheless, I feel that the Baltics are usually very familiar with being on the receiving end of this narrative, because you read an article in Politico or Foreign Policy or The Atlantic, and you're like, hey, like they didn't get the local context right or something. So it's always, I love how you are bringing this other perspective there. And actually, what I want to ask you about is the local attitudes from your exhibition in 2004. So I did a little bit of digging and looked at some newspaper articles or reviews of the exhibition, because it was not a solo exhibition. It was obviously part of a bigger Dutch package. But specifically in terms of United Nations buses coursing through Vilnius, it seemed that the spectators were like really perplexed as to what the meaning of this should be. So one of the reviewers wrote something like, the bus was the good news of Western promises being delivered. I was like, well, that's a spin, like basically a 180 degrees opposite as to what you're trying to show. So, but again, like it seemed to me that when Lithuania was trying to present itself as a modern country, 2004 is the membership accession year for both NATO and the EU, and they were trying to show that we're part of the West, we're going all the way, the Soviet past is behind, and here you are basically portraying Lithuania as a recipient of military aid. So basically, not someone who would be part of these missions, but kind of saying that, you are the front where the battle is happening. So I think that there's a lot that piqued my curiosity there, and I think it would be really interesting to hear what you remember being social reactions in Lithuania and abroad as well.
Yeah, well, I was actually quite anxious at the time, because you had Soviet tanks here at the TV tower in 1991. So actual conflict was quite recent and still very. You always have this neighbor in the background, as we are now acutely aware of. So for me, the UN operations were basically in our streets and as being the protected, well-protected West. So when I do it in Germany or in Austria, then it's completely clear that this is ironical. And of course, we are usually the partaker in the peacekeeping operations. And this to me I was assuming that this was similar in Baltic states or in Lithuania. But then when I read up on what I was actually doing, so I wasn't so sure, mm-hmm. But that's the whole nature of this project. The UN, the fictitious UN operator is a catalyst, and you don't know what the reactions are, but there are always reactions, because there's always it is a sort of an invitation to a thought experiment, right? If you see these things in your street, you're bound to ask, why are they here, and what did we do wrong, or what's going on? So, and then there's also always something going on. There's always anxieties about things. So you can conjure up whatever insecurity is lingering in a country, and it will flare up in a moment of crisis. You see that happening, of course, the whole time. So I wasn't actually too sure about how people would react. I also didn't care because it was kind of conceptually also part of the project that the people who were actually on the buses, but because they did their usual rounds, they were kind of like the collateral, right? I was imposing this concept on them, and I didn't care what they felt about it. So they're like completely they're externalities. They're part of the equation, but they have no agency. So it was in that case, it was kind of also. You wouldn't be. I think it would be morally wrong nowadays because we have to be participatory and ask everybody and much more working together.
But it is in line with what you described, right? How the UN comes and just imposes things.
It's part of this kind of process. The Iraqis weren't asked whether they wanted democracy. They were just bombed the shit out of them, and then now, create your own parties and see how that worked out, right? That's. I think sometimes I'm actually an officially declared pacifist. I'm not so sure these days with Ukraine and everything, but I have a thought in my mind that a lot of everything that happened since World War II, it can basically be traced back by the military victory of the Allied forces, which made it seem like a good idea to go somewhere and bring democracy by force. Because it worked then, you just go somewhere, you bring your troops, you spend a ton of martial help money on these countries, and then they will blossom into democracies like Western Europe did. Only, of course, Western Europe had already been doing its homework for 300 years on becoming democracy, so it wasn't. That was waiting to have it. The seeds were sown. But in Afghanistan and in Iraq and all these other places, they do not have that culture in that way. They have a different way of organizing their societies. So then it doesn't work.
So as now you're being gently shoehorned to represent the Dutch here with us today. I think it's interesting also to remind our listeners that the Netherlands had a very specific and painful experience with a peacekeeping mission in Serbia. And exactly. So do you want to maybe share just briefly like how maybe that impacted your views on the United Nations or just...
Well, actually, I'm a great fan of the United Nations. I wish it would happen. I would work. But of course, they are also a tool of it's in the end that it's all about powers and resources, basically, who commands which resources, and they are also a pawn in that. I would love them to be the actual court. I mean, we have in The Hague the International Court of Justice, and I would like that to work. I would like the Americans also to subscribe to that, not just help implement it, but also be subject to that court. And I would like the United Nations to march into any area where there is wrongdoing, like a world police almost, and say, stop now, no more bombing of the innocent. But that's never what happens. And in the second Iraq war, it was like a very, very close call that they would even have been instrumentalized into what I would say is like an imperialist war by the powers that be.
But do you think that maybe the sort of broad assessment of UN failure in Serbia and Srebrenica in the early 90s shaped what happened in Iraq in any way?
No, I don't think so. More in the sense that they never learn. I think it did shape. That was actually your question. I'm sorry. It did shape also the views in the Netherlands because we still also very much subscribe to the whole thought of NATO and the Transatlantic Alliance, but also to United Nations, anything, and the European Union. We're a very mercantile nation, so we want peace and quiet to do business. Basically, that's always the bottom line, I think, with us. And there's no real us, of course, because what I'm saying now does not reflect the general views in the Netherlands, I'm sure. But Srebrenica is still something that's in the news like almost every week, because it's it was 6,000 people being killed on your watch, and it strikes also deeper traumas like from the Second World War. We were the country with per capita the most Jews being deported, which has a lot of reasons, but it's not something to be proud of, and it's something to question to question yourself about, of course.
I think Lithuania is also still dealing a lot with coming to a place of a new collective narrative, how we talk about the Holocaust, Lithuania's role in it. And so it's interesting to hear that, Anne Frank's country is also still having this.
She did so much for distorting the view on the Dutch. We were all heroes, but no, of course there were absolutely heroes, and a lot of them. But there were as many active heroes as there were active collaborators. And these are like maybe together 2%. And the rest were just people who were complacent. I think that's really the bottom line under each international or challenge is basically people's need for complacency. It's staggering. You believe any narrative as long as it keeps you safe. Basically.
I think it's so important to hear you say that, because I think for Lithuanians, the historical narrative has been exactly that. We were the heroic nation, and we like those narratives about people who saved and hid the Jews in their houses. But percentage-wise, it's a very small percentage, and it's been such a difficult uphill struggle for people to accept responsibility for what has been done. That, again, to hear that a Western country such as the Netherlands is still on a similar path, I think it gives us hope and encouragement.
Well, add to that, of course, are dealing with our colonial past in various parts of the world, both the transatlantic slave trade to Suriname and Antilles, as well, of course, the 300-year-long occupation of Indonesia, where we had our war genocides there, a lot of them, and in all these places. It seems to be what people do, but it's certainly a very dark picture, which is also demanding to be center stage these days. I mean, it's one of the better things actually, that we're really looking into these matters from a more diverse perspective. So both socially, of course, where we're opening up to all kinds of new perspective. Really, there seems to be a breakthrough in a lot of the whole intersectional emancipatory spectrum. And actually, really, that's a hopeful thing of these days. I mean, there's a lot of things to be very concerned about, but it's actually beautiful that that's finally seeming to be coming over a tipping point where that becomes the mainstream narrative, which is very good. And of course also the post-colonial view, which it's really weird. We have the royal family in the Netherlands, they have this golden carriage. It was given to them by the city of Amsterdam somewhere around the turn of the 19th century. And for years it was paraded around the country, nobody noticed. And it was even exhibited in the center of Amsterdam in 2011. Nobody noticed. And then it was exhibited last year. And then people pointed out that one half of it is completely covered with the most racist colonial imagery you can imagine. It's like all these people of color representing their countries kneeling for the fat white lady. Wow. Representing Netherlands with a horn of plenty on her lap, and these people feeling the horn. It's completely obscene. But we never thought it was so, because we've been. I mean, I learned at school that we did bad things and there was slavery and colonialism and that we did all things wrong, but somehow it didn't register emotionally. We're still kind of also proud that we were so proud, so rich and powerful, and now all of a sudden the golden carriage is no longer used. Usually it was used every year, at least once a year, to on the day the parliament is presented with the how do you call it, the economic plans of the year. That's also a big thing. Like it's exactly the same as in the United Kingdom. Basically, was a briefcase with all the paperwork and the king doing a speech and everything. But that changed. So no longer the golden carriage. They had another one, fortunately, and it's also really, really garish. It's
wow.
But it's yeah.
You're listening to NARA Podcast. NARA is an independent, non-profit media space run by journalists in Vilnius. We work in Lithuanian and English languages, and we need your support. If you like what you're hearing, visit contribee.com/NARA and join our membership program. Once again, it's contribee.com/NARA. And now, let's go back to the studio with Eglė Elena Murauskaitė and Edwin Zwakman.
You mentioned that sometimes we're so used to certain visual cues or certain narratives. It's like, the neurons that wire together, and it kind of deepens the paths of habitual thinking and habitual narration about certain things that are really hard to change. And you could think of even things, starting from exactly like you said, recognizing only white men as citizens worthy a vote and rights to hold property, to, organization of societies into states. Neither of these things were how things have been done forever, but they have been done like this long enough that it seems like natural, and it seems awkward to even challenge that. So it's really interesting that one of the goals that you proclaim with your installations, the visual reconstructions of reality, is exactly to try and poke some holes in it. It's like showing a picture and like something is slightly wrong and you're not quite sure, and it gives you a discomfort and sort of makes you think like, what is it? It feels familiar, but at the same time, it's not quite it. So do you want to reflect a little bit on what are some of the narratives that you are trying to challenge?
Yeah, well, it's this whole mechanism where I try to challenge whatever it is that is challenging you. So basically, I try to activate your own inner challenger. Basically, I think all my works, whether they're stage photography in the studio or making kindly slightly off. Architectural structures in real life. It's always playing with this perception thing, challenging what we see, and it always uses the mechanism where people don't look, they project. That's what our eyes literally do. They pick up very, very little bit of information when we're looking, and the brain constructs the image.
From memory.
From memory. Well, from prejudice, basically. And that's very useful. But the problem is we keep doing that also when we should be reflecting, of course, and we should be challenging maybe what we see. And yeah, this is a very deeply rooted tool from the body, basically, with which we make sense of things, because otherwise it would be too much to process. But this is also what happens when we read the news about China. Also, the journalists, because they do not have that much space to tell their story, they have to kind of reconstruct everything from the bits that we know. So they use the terms like parliament and president and the things that we know, but they mean something completely different in the Chinese concept. That's not the same at all. So the moment you start, first you conjuring up this narrative basically by these images, which you need because you have only a set of lines to fill. You're already starting to completely distort what's actually beneath the narrative. You're already shaping a narrative that's such a simplification that you might as well not give it, because it's actually really wrong. For instance, the way the Tiananmen massacre in China was portrayed in the West, it was in 1989. It was very much seen in the same light as the developments in Eastern Europe, of course. Because it was also the Communist Party, it was also a popular uprising against something, only that it wasn't at all that. It was, in China, it was actually people who were in support of a more progressive communist, very popular communist leader. In the main, of course, it was very, very, very heterogenic crew there on the Tiananmen Square, of course. So there was that. There's no simple narrative there either. But on the whole, there were a lot of Chinese leaders at the time, among which the president. He was very much in favor of the students, to give them more of a vote, more openness, more for say. So, and he became sidetracked after that because the hardliners won, of course, in the end.
So I think this is really interesting, and it's a good example. I think many of the listeners will not be familiar with this more nuanced interpretation with either of Tiananmen Square events, or I think it's interesting that you bring it up, that basically by trying to but trying to make something understandable, you reshape it. Like I myself have been regularly very critical of this soundbite culture in the media and in general trying to flatten the narrative about what is going on. And then, well, of course, you lose the points that form the key message because you flatten it so much. I always advocate that, people are capable of understanding things if you take the time to explain them. But I love how you bring in this extra notion about, the way you choose to explain them, things that might reshape narrative as well.
Yeah. I'm very often also astounded by people like in the Netherlands. I talk to people and they're studying, I don't know, some kind of African culture in anthropology. But they had never been there and they don't speak the language. But it's not necessary because the whole study is about researching sources. But these sources, of course, who challenges those? And they also come already from a narrative. And if you do that for a couple of centuries, you'll be in a completely world of your own, basically. It's not really connecting.
I think it's really interesting also with what's happening in Ukraine. I could sit here all day naming examples, but I remember distinctly from my own research. So the war in some form, like gray zone conflict, more of a crisis, has been raging since 2014. And I remember there was this trend of foreigners from Eastern Europe, from actually all around the world, coming to fight in Ukraine, especially when it was not a violent conflict, like early in the stages, like 2015, maybe 16. And so this in 2022, when Russia invaded and when the conflict turned really hot, the number of journalists who called me asking, like, are we going to have the problem of radicalized foreign fighters like in Syria, like in ISIS?
Wow.
Because, it's the same pattern, right? Foreigners go to fight, they come back radicalized. Oh my God, like where do you begin to explain like what is the difference between ISIS in Syria and Ukrainians in Ukrainian territory?
But then again,
that's...
Isn't that different? Because you do get this also extreme right-wing groups going there. We've seen a lot of the countries in Eastern Europe collaborating with the Nazis also already in the Second World War against the Russians, very understandably. You also saw it in Ireland, of course, so some sympathies for the Nazis, or because they were against against England, or in Belgium because they were against the Wallonians, but also of course in Croatia and all these countries there were a lot of forces at hand, which still, these interests are still there. That doesn't mean that these people are Nazis necessarily, but there are those who are actually Nazis. Maybe not Nazis, but fascist, yes, definitely.
So, a couple of things are probably worth mentioning that really, as I found in my own research actually, early, again, when the war wasn't so violent, there was more of a tendency of people with more extreme views to go in there and get trained. The fear was, the narratives I was encountering was about radicalization, that people would go in, learn to fight, and come home, become radicalized. However, the number of actual radicals, even the right-wing ones, we understand was a ridiculously small number of those people. But they were already radical when they were going into Ukraine. And when the war turned violent in 2022, there was virtually very, very, very little presence from them. And actually most right-wing recruitment blogs, sites, organizations, they encourage their members not to go to Ukraine because it was too dangerous. And I think in Lithuania, people are familiar with the turnabout phase with the Azov, that they did a real good shakeup there. But I think more generally, it is really relevant what you bring up again. Another sort of batch of this narrative, counter-narrative that, in the war in Ukraine, Lithuania especially, but the West more in generally are very supportive of Ukraine. Everybody, of course, wants Ukraine to prevail. And then there's this, this flattening of the narrative that these are the good guys, we cheer them on. And there is so much information that is being suppressed that, these good guys, they do get to make difficult decisions. It is a war, and not every single one of them is necessarily psychologically stable. Maybe even if they were, after this brutal meat grinder they're being pushed through, things do happen. And people they're like, oh, la, 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 I'll cover my ears. Nothing is happening because these are all heroes. So again, these are some really difficult things to reckon with. I wonder maybe if you want to tell us in a couple of words, how is the war in Ukraine going in the Netherlands? What are the perceptions? What are the key narratives there? I think it would be interesting for our listeners.
I would say that there's 100% support for the Ukrainians. We're also very already much sooner than the Germans sending weaponry and aid and everything. So there's no doubt about what should be done, and also I'd say actually it's quite an extreme view. I think the general view is that the Russians should be out of all the gained territories entirely. No peace talks until that's actually achieved. Sort of like that. So it's definitely, because it's weird, because the Dutch are on the whole very prone to compromise. They really, really love compromise above anything else. But not in this case. It's very. But I think it's actually not just the Netherlands. I think it's somehow there was like this goes too far in the whole of
in Germany
at least,
as well, right?
Yes, absolutely, in Western Europe for sure, but not in China for instance, or in India or in Brazil, where people are further away. They do not have this same because these are narratives who go back even way before the Second World War. Of course, this is very ingrained in our national identities, I think, and of course here much stronger than for us. But I also grew up during the Cold War, and the Second World War never really ended. I mean, it actually ended on the premise of the Yalta Conference, which was of course an incredibly unfair peace offering of half of Europe being basically delivered to Stalin. It was really, really the start of a new conflict. And I think that's something that is felt, of course, in the whole of Europe, but here much more acutely, of course, I suppose.
So it's interesting also, at the time when we're recording this, the 3rd of April, it's still quite recent news that Vladimir Putin, Russian president, has been wanted by The Hague, the International Criminal Court. Yeah. Well, at the same time, like an April Fool's joke, on the 1st of April, Russia took the presidency, the rotating presidential chair of the UN Security Council. So do you want to maybe say a few words about that? Like, how is the Hague indictment? Is it like a popular decision in the Netherlands? Has it affected the mood in any way?
I've not discussed it with anyone, so I've only read it in the newspapers, and there basically people are much more writing about the reactions in other countries. I don't know how it is perceived in the Netherlands, and I'm probably not typically Dutch. I mean, the first reaction, of course, well, that's never going to happen, but I think it is a strong signal. And it's actually also really ironically and funny that actually Trump is indicted in the same week. So maybe there is some justice against these usurpers that just think they can get away with everything. I mean, who knows?
Well, if you really want to go down that route, then you should be after George W. Bush rather than Trump. But
that is true, but he's so cute. I mean, he's a likable criminal. Yeah.
Right. So again, the narratives and the visuals, right? Like, oh, maybe you ordered the unlawful invasion where thousands of people were dying and, psychologically maimed, and Iraq as a country is still recovering. But hey, like you're really sorry about that. We feel for you.
Well, they're not, right? And so isn't Blair. They're still standing by, because otherwise they would have to basically admit to a crime, and which it was. It was a total scam, the whole thing, and. But I know that these debates were already going on at the time. That people, and it's all about information in the end. Are there MODs or not? or MMDs. What's it again? Weapons of mass.
WMDs.
Sorry,
yes, weapons of mass destruction.
Exactly. Well, there weren't, but we were told that there were. But now it's obviously clear that everybody knew that there weren't any. So yeah. But that was just the trigger, of course. They just wanted to be there. That was.
It's really interesting also that you bring that up, because in my recent research about Ukraine and how the United States were signaling about the impending Russian invasion in 2022, that they were sharing intelligence publicly with European allies as well as with Ukraine before, and warning them. But so many diplomats that I talked to said exactly that. Well, wait a minute, we've seen the sharing of American intelligence. Is it a really genuine offering?
Yeah.
So it really tarnished U.S. efforts to sort of garner a coalition against Russia. In this case, it came back to bite them in the behind.
Well, that's also the difficult thing about the West. The West is very slippery because of our democratic mechanisms. You have always these different phases of one culture. Right? If you are in the United States, there's so much incredibly positive things going on as well, and people working for the greater good, and also towards international policies, geopolitical issues. I mean, we can be really. I'm still happy with Pax Americana, right? It's for all the criticism you could have against that as well, but that's sometimes very, very different. One of my key experiences in China was when I was at the Tiananmen on the 20th anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre. Was a Chinese woman who was my assistant then, and she was like hardly born at the time. And I asked her about what went down there, what she thought about that, and she said, "Well, I don't like to be quizzed on an exam that we didn't pass." And I said, "Girl, you weren't even born yet. Why do you take responsibility for that?" Mm-hmm. But that's how it works. That's not in a way that China is not a dictatorship. It's a collectivist country, and people subscribe to everything that goes on in their society as being part of them, and we don't do that. I reap the benefits of the riches of the West, everything that's brought in here by all the colonial or imperialists or all the structures that are still basically in place, sucking the world dry with resources, heaping it up in this little part of the world where I happen to live. But I can say I'm not responsible for that because I vote for the Greens. I'm a pacifist. I'm against colonialism. And I can say that freely without going to jail and have this opinion. But in the end of the day, I'm part of it, very much so. I have an iPhone and a Mac laptop. These resources come from places and from structures that are near slavery conditions. If they wouldn't be, I would never be able to afford them. So I'm totally part of that system. And I think that's sometimes, that's a very complicated matter in our society. You want this ambiguity, you want to be open and criticize, but I think if you're in the receiving end of Western aggression, you don't care too much about that, right? And that's sometimes a perspective that I bring with me when I look at a Russian perspective, a Chinese perspective. I mean, of course, I don't want the Uyghurs to be into labor camps, and I don't want Taiwan to be taken or all that shit. But still, if I turn back the perspective and look from their side, I should really also not think that we are the good guys, because we are robbing the world blind of its resources. We are responsible for the biggest carbon footprint in the history of mankind and all that. And that's all us. That's not just the bad companies in our society or the wrong parties or George Bush or anybody. That's us. We should really take more ownership of the responsibilities that comes with living in even a democracy, because it's really it's problematic that the good thing, which is the diversity in our society, also can be the bad thing, where we just present the face that is convenient and live with basically a very hypocritical condition as a group. So we should maybe have a little bit more of that collectivist perspective on ourselves and our society than we are used to, which is very uncomfortable for us because we want to be individualist and be critical of things.
I think, that's a very beautiful perspective to bring sort of as we're concluding this conversation. Again, I find both myself and just a general tendency that it's so comfortable when you can paint the world in black and white. These are the good guys, these are the bad guys. It is so difficult to balance the gray space of ambiguity, including internally, to keep making the choices, to keep asking the questions, to keep really looking to see rather than to reconstruct from memory. So do you want to maybe say as a conclusion to our conversation, something, some last thoughts about the exhibition and your art and this invitation to a more responsible balancing act that you are trying to invite us into?
Well, I haven't seen the exhibition yet, so I'm very curious about it. I think it's a beautiful idea to see yourself as a city through the ages, through the eyes of others. I think that's a really good start in changing your perspective, of course. So in that, actually, in a more peaceful, less political way, I think this is a very good exhibition. It's something that we should do the whole time, because seeing yourself in your completeness also it's challenging, but it's also just so rewarding, and life becomes about something. And because otherwise we will have to wake up to bad skeletons in the closet every time we look back at the crisis. We should really address the ambiguity in the moment, and not wait for 100 years after the war or the crimes are perpetrated. We can prevent them and be just as rich and powerful, or whatever we want to be, probably without these crimes. We don't need them, but for that it takes a critical eye and to look into detail, to see the ambiguity, see the layeredness of every situation, and see both sides of each issue. Even if it seems completely one-sided and completely black and white, it never is.
Thank you. I think really it reminds us all that basically behind our greatest fears and darkest shadows, there's always the biggest reward. That's where you have to go. The only way is through, basically. So thank you to Edwin Zwakman for talking to us today. And again, we invite the listeners to both reflect on the multitude of rich issues that we have raised here today, and consider taking them in through an artistic perspective at the exhibition at the National Gallery of Art in Vilnius that opens on April 7th. This was a NARA podcast, Eglė Elena Murauskaitė and Edwin Zwakman. Thank you.
My pleasure.
That is our show today. You heard the conversation between Edwin Zwakman and Eglė Elena Murauskaitė. After the recording, our colleague Karolis Pilypas Liutkevičius took photos of Eglė and Edwin. You can see them at nara.lt and our Instagram page, instagram.com/NARA Journalistica. This episode was a partnership between NARA and Contemporary Art Center in Vilnius. As always, we want to thank Martynas Mažvydas National Library, where we record our interviews. The sound engineer here is Kata Bitoft. Our original music score is by Martynas Gailius, and my name is Karolis Vyšniauskas. See you next week.